Good morning, and thank you for your interest in my presentation. Today I'm going to present some results from my postdoc work at UC Berkeley studying the effect of different land covers on the atmospheric boundary layer height. I would like to start with some background. Why is it important to study the atmospheric boundary layer height? Well, the boundary layer controls the air quality, and as you can see in this picture, a high boundary layer or a tall boundary layer dilutes pollutants, whereas the shorter boundary layer would increase the concentration of those pollutants at the surface. The boundary layer also is very important to determine the weather, to determine the formation of clouds and fog, determine the temperature we experience, but also very importantly, it has important effects on plant growth and also on the generation of wind energy. So how do biophysical processes affect the boundary layer, in particular the land cover dynamics? Well, I like this picture because it not only shows the height of the boundary layer characterized by shallow cumulus clouds above it, but also because it shows the mosaic of different land covers underneath. It makes me think of the role that all these land covers play. The height of the atmospheric boundary layer height is a combination of large-scale synoptic processes, but also very importantly, surface processes. The partitioning of net radiation between sensible and latent heat fluxes creates convective eddies that enhance the entrainment of hotter and drier air and make the boundary layer grow. The role of plants here is critical because plants can increase the amount of latent heat fluxes, reducing the amount of sensible heat fluxes, and therefore creating a shorter boundary layer. However, because higher latent heat fluxes also increase the humidity, there could be a feedback where latent heat fluxes are reduced and therefore sensible heat fluxes are increased and the boundary layer can grow again. Very importantly, all these processes are controlled by stomata, which are these organelles on the leaf that control how much water is exported to the atmosphere. They can open and close to determine how much water they lose. Also very important is to consider the effect of large-scale atmospheric subsidence. That is this large-scale downward movement that can bring the atmospheric boundary layer down. This subsidence effect is very important in our study site, Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta in California, where we have a meso-network of eddy covariance towers in some of the most important land covers of the site, particularly corn and alfalfa, but also some important wetlands, which is important because currently the Department of Water Resources in California is trying to convert a lot of these agricultural lands back to the original wetland land cover, which would enhance the formation of soil and therefore reduce some of the critical land subsidence that may affect the distribution of water to all California. So very important also we have here this wind profiler, which is part of NOAA's wind profiler network, which allows us to have continuous measurements of boundary layer height. So one of the first steps in this project was to use the data from this radar wind profiler that takes the vertical profile of the signal to noise ratio of the radar returns to calculate the atmospheric boundary layer height. But there was a problem, and it was that there was not a good way to extract the information needed, and the algorithm I was using was not offering consistent results. So I decided to tackle this problem by investing into a new algorithm to detect boundary layer height that is now available on my GitHub account that you can see here. So we tested this algorithm against radiosonde data, which gave us satisfactory results and confidence to move forward. So now that we have the information from the radar wind profiler, we can then estimate some annual trends in boundary layer height in the delta. So as you can see here, starting in January, the boundary layer height starts to grow. Here you can see some dots that represent daily maximum values, and the black line, which represents a smoothed line. And you can see here there's an increase, but then there's a decrease in the late summer in between July and October in both 2018 and 2019. And this decrease is interesting because it wasn't related to a decrease in air temperature, or it wasn't also specifically a reduction in net radiation, since California summers are very dry and cloudless. But it seemed to be related to surface processes. In particular, here you see the evaporative fraction, which you can see here an increase in that evaporative fraction during that critical period between July and October. And also in the secondary y-axis, you see the normalized different vegetation index, which has a strong increase during this period. And this increase is related to the timing of corn emergence and corn harvesting, where corn is the most abundant land cover in the site, and there is a very strong signal, signal of higher latent heat fluxes throughout the site during this time. So it makes sense that maybe it is this phenology of corn that is driving the boundary layer height. And you can see that same effect through our meso network of eddy covariance towers, in particular the sensible heat fluxes here, or the potential virtual temperature fluxes to be more specific. You can also see this strong decrease. But of course, we know that surface processes are not the only process ruling the atmospheric boundary layer height, so we also need to take into account the effect of subsidence. And in the delta, we do see a strong subsidence during the summer months as well. So we need to consider that. And also we need to consider the advection of heat, which is very negative during that peak period in the late summer, and this is associated with strong marine layer during this time, and also the advection of humidity from the ocean, which is also very, very strong during the late summer. And you can also see something that about the entrainment fluxes through the models that we use. But perhaps the best way to understand all these complex processes that drive the boundary layer height is to use models. In this case, I use slab models or mixed layer models, where we assume a homogeneous profile in potential temperature and specific humidity, and we also assume an infinitesimally small jump in potential temperature and specific humidity as well, and a lapse rate or gamma value that determines the slope in that increase in temperature. So we evaluate a hierarchy of three models. The M&S or Magnafan-Spriggs, that is simpler model that assumes constant lapse rates or gamma values. We also have the Bach-Verhoeven grinding, which has a higher level of complexity because it adds the effects of mechanical turbulence or shear effects, parameterized here through this term. And finally, the class model, which is the most comprehensive model that includes not only changes in gamma with boundary layer height and shear effects, here parameterized like this, but also parameterizations for the changes in the jump in virtual potential temperature and specific humidity. Also very important parameterizations for subsidence, which in this case are parameterized by the large-scale horizontal wind divergence. So how good are these lab models when we compare them against the radar wind profilers? This graph you see in the comparison organized in periods of 2 months for the year of 2018. You see here the x-axis, the hour of the day, and the y-axis, the boundary layer height. The boundary layer height from the profiler is shown by the black line, whereas the models are shown by these other three colors. You see here that uh, there's a fairly good agreement, and it was highly satisfactory, except perhaps here in the late summer, which was due to the effects of strong subsidence and advection. And now with the model, we can ask interesting questions to assess the patterns of boundary layer height. For instance, what is the actual effect of subsidence on the atmospheric boundary layer height? Here, using the simplest model, we can see that if we didn't include subsidence, there would be a strong increase in the height of the boundary layer height, going from about a mean of 700 meters to a mean of about 1,200 meters during the highest uh, during the months of highest boundary layer height. So that was very interesting to see. Another interesting question that we can ask is, to what extent changing the land cover affects the boundary layer height? Remember that the Department of Water Resources in California is already planning to do this. So here, for instance, you can see here the annual pattern in boundary layer height using the compound surface flux, which is calculated based on the relative contributions of all the different land covers to the surface heat fluxes. So now we can tweak the model to, for instance, just only include forcing from water. And because it has high latent heat fluxes and low sensible heat fluxes, you can see that there will be a strong decrease. We can also look at what corn would do, and we could see a strong increase in May, but and we can also see things with alfalfa. Now, this is the simplest model, the McNaughton and Spriggs model. Now, we can see the same graph as before, but this time we have the effect of subsidence and advection. Now, when using different land covers here, like you see here some differences, but they're not as strong. And you can see that during those months with strong subsidence and advection, like these months here, the effect of land cover is really minimal. You can also see here the same for alfalfa. Now, to finalize, in these plots, you can see the concentration of methane and CO2 in a corn crop, the most abundant cover in the delta. In the y-axis, you see the concentration of methane and CO2 in parts per million, and in the x-axis, you see the daily maximum boundary layer height in kilometers. As you can see, and as is expected, when the boundary layer height was high, there was a lower concentration of methane, more dilution of methane and CO2. In contrast, when the boundary layer height was low, there was a much higher concentration of methane and CO2. Remember, these are daytime mean concentrations. We're not dealing with nighttime at the moment. However, what is most interesting about this plot is the color code of the points here, that is color-coded based on the specific humidity advection. So you see here that in days with low advection, advection of marine air from the ocean, here represented in yellow, the concentration of methane was maintained very high. However, when the advection was very high, such as these points here in blue, you can see that the concentration of methane and CO2 remained low. And what this means is that this advection is flushing all that methane and CO2 that comes from the surface via cattle or maybe some wetlands, and it's flushing it out and keeping the concentration low. So you see here the important role that advection plays in controlling the concentration of methane, CO2, and other greenhouse gases in the surface. In conclusion, we have seen that a new algorithm to estimate the boundary layer height from radar wind profiler has been developed, that you can access it in my GitHub account, and I hope some of you can find it useful for your research. We've also seen that sensible heat fluxes from different land covers partially drive the growth of the boundary layer height. However, these land cover effects can be muted by strong subsidence and advection in the delta and potentially in other sites. Lastly, we saw that understanding the dynamics of boundary layer height and advection is crucial to better understand the concentration of methane and other greenhouse gases within the boundary layer. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.